John Dickinson is one of the most significant founders of the United States who is not well known by all the American public. Author Jane E. Calvert is trying to change that with her new biography, Penman of the Founding. John Dickinson is known for his 9 essays under the title Fabius, published anonymously in newspapers during the time that the states were deciding on whether to approve the new Constitution. John Dickinson of Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania was the only founding figure present and active in every phase of the Revolution, from the Stamp Act crisis through the ratification of the Constitution. Jane Calvert, author of Penman of the Founding. Let me start with you. Earlham College. That's my home state, Indiana. And my first ever celebrity interview in high school was with a band leader named Tex Beneke at Earlham College. So I got to start with that. Why did you go there?
Well, I'm originally from Indiana. I was born in Greencastle, and my father taught for almost 40 years at DePauw University in Greencastle. And I grew up in Los Angeles, though, for the most part, actually in the areas that have been ravaged by the fires recently. So that's pretty gut-wrenching. But I wanted to go to a small liberal arts college, and Earlham College was someplace where I could get tuition remission because of my father's teaching in one of the Great Lakes College Association colleges. And so, yeah, I went there not really knowing anything about Quakers. It's a Quaker college, and I didn't really know anything about Quakers or Quakerism. So, yeah, that's how I ended up there.
So can you tell us what a Quaker is?
Yes. Quaker is actually originally a derogatory name for a member of the Religious Society of Friends. This was a dissenting religious group that arose during the English Civil War in the 1650s. And they are actually the only radical dissenting religious group that arose during that time to survive until today. And now Quakers live throughout the country. It's an active faith, and they are most known for their pacifism and also their sort of social justice work. They were the sort of original founders of the women's rights movement, the abolitionist movement, the temperance movement, and they've been actually a huge force in American society since before our founding.
So Quakerism plays a big role in your book. How?
Well, so my first book, Quaker Constitutionalism and the Political Thought of John Dickinson, lays out the Quaker theory of a civil constitution and what a people is to do if the government is oppressive. And their answer to that was there should never be revolution or violence, that the government should be protested through civil disobedience, which is a theory and practice that they pioneered. And John Dickinson, it turns out, was sort of the most visible practitioner of this constitutional theory. And he himself was not a Quaker. So understanding Dickinson, you really have to first understand Quakerism. And so I started with that in, my first book. And then it continues, of course, in Penman of the Founding, because really Dickinson's Quaker upbringing and his work in the Pennsylvania Assembly in colonial Pennsylvania was, of course, owned and governed by Quakers. And so, yes, you really can't understand Dickinson without understanding Quakerism.
How much Quakerism was there in his family? And I know about his wife, who you can tell us about, but were there members of his own family that were Quakers?
Yes, both of his parents were, and he was raised as a Quaker. Although, as I said, he never actually joined the meeting and became an official member. He still was raised with the beliefs and the practices, and he even became more Quakerly over the course of his life. By the end of his life, even some of his closest friends didn't realize he wasn't an actual Quaker. He dressed plainly as Quakers did and spoke plainly using thee and thou instead of you. Um, and and so yes, he was really indistinguishable from a Quaker, from his upbringing and his immediate family, his wife especially.
Go back to Earlham College just for a second. Did you have to do things Quaker when you were there?
Yes, yes and no. So there was so every there are a number of Quaker colleges and schools in the country, and every place has its own kind of peculiar brand of Quakerism. And Earlham certainly did as well. And the way the classes were run and the way meetings were run were very much according to Quaker principles, so kind of egalitarian. For example, we didn't call professors doctor or professor with titles. We used their first names, which frankly made me a little uncomfortable because my father was a professor, and I had always been used to hearing titles, so that was a little strange for me. And just sort of the I guess the atmosphere of the college was pretty, I would say, far left on the political spectrum. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. On the other hand, there were no requirements at the college to, attend the Quaker meeting for worship or to learn Quaker history, which I think would have been really valuable because I certainly, as I said, I didn't know anything about Quakerism going into the college. And I don't think I really got a great sort of impression of it there because I only knew kind of what I saw on the surface, and there wasn't sort of a lot of more formal education about it. So I didn't actually learn about Quakerism itself until I went to graduate school and started studying religious movements and their intersection with politics in early America and actually in Europe more broadly.
Big jump from Earlham to the University of Chicago. How,
Yes.
how did that happen?
Well, actually, there's an intermediate step in there. So after I graduated from Earlham, which was, as I said, fairly far left, my first job after college was at the Hudson Institute, which is a neoconservative public policy think tank. And I worked there at an education reform project. And so whereas I'd been sort of seen as, by some people as more sort of, I guess, moderate or conservative when I was at Earlham. When I was at Hudson, I was kind of seen as the kind of a joke was like I was kind of like a liberal mole. And and I guess for my part, I was just really kind of perplexed by the extremes of politics and how Americans related to one another and to their government. What did they expect of one another? What did they expect of the government? What did they see as their rights and responsibilities? And I was just sort of disturbed by how poorly people treated one another, and wanted to know what how we were founded and how we got to where we were at that time in the 90s, the early 90s. And so I decided to go to graduate school in history, in intellectual history, to get answers to those questions. And so, yes, I ended up at the University of Chicago and studying intellectual history. And so looking at, the, 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 the ancient Greeks and the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and then eventually, early American history, just, to try to kind of understand current political culture.
First moment you can remember hearing the name John Dickinson?
um, well, I don't know that I heard it at first. I read it, and as I was doing my readings for my exams and my courses, his name kept coming up, and I started to wonder, who is this person? I'd never heard of him, of course, and the more I read, the more confusion I saw. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to know, who was this person and why was there so much confusion surrounding him?
In the back of the book, the epilogue, you take on the politics of all this. And I want you to talk it through, because you're suggesting that there were reasons why we don't know much about John Dickinson.
That's absolutely.
I'll mention one just to start you off: George Bancroft. Who was George Bancroft?
George Bancroft was one of the preeminent historians in antebellum America, so before the Civil War. And he was a New Englander, and part of what we consider to be a Whig historian, and WHIG. And what that means is that he was someone who basically had this very kind of celebratory view of American history. They believed, Whig historians believed, that sort of the revolution was inevitable, the American founding was inevitable, and that we're progressing and continue to progress towards this sort of divinely ordained end point where America is thoroughly glorified. And these Whig historians, especially George Bancroft, really sort of painted the founding as this, it's just sort of kind of divinely ordained moment in history that should be celebrated. And so he has this massive work on the history of the American Revolution. It's many volumes long, and in his telling of the story, he definitely told it as sort of heroes and villains, and of course the villains are the British and the heroes are the Americans, and particularly John Adams, his fellow New Englander, was his hero of the story. And then of course, if you have a hero, you need an anti-hero, you need a villain, and Dickinson became that villain because Dickinson refused to vote on or sign the Declaration of Independence. And so it was a very sort of nationalistic view of history, without nuance, without subtlety. And of course, Bancroft, being a New Englander and celebrating John Adams, a New Englander, that is a tradition based on going back to the founding of Massachusetts and the New England colonies, is based on Puritanism. And now Puritanism, by the time of John Adams, was long gone, but the legacy of Puritanism still remained. And Puritans and Quakers were really kind of mortal enemies, and the Puritans persecuted the Quakers mercilessly, persecuted them by executing them and discriminating against them in various ways. And so because John Adams was, his religious background was Puritanism, and Dickinson's religious background was Quakerism, that kind of almost set them up to be enemies, at least political enemies. And so they were. They indeed were enemies. So when Bancroft was writing, and he's drawing on Adams' telling of American history, which now scholars recognize that Adams is not a reliable narrator. But Bancroft took Adams at at his word, and also others like Jefferson at his word, and they disparaged Dickinson, and so Bancroft just adopted this and more or less did a hit job on Dickinson's legacy. And before Bancroft, Dickinson was still celebrated as an American hero, but after Bancroft, nobody really wanted to take on looking at Dickinson anymore because he had been so thoroughly vilified.
In this chapter, you characterize it any way you want to, but it appears to me that you were stepping on some pretty big toes, including David McCullough and his book on John Adams and the HBO miniseries. Why?
Well, look, I love that HBO miniseries, by the way. It's just spectacular. But it's really only accurate if it is, if you understand it as history being seen through the eyes of John Adams. David McCullough was what I would consider to be a sort of a neo-Whig historian. Again, seeing the Declaration of Independence and the American founding as a foregone conclusion, and sort of disparaging or at least minimizing any kind of dissenting voices. And so insofar as McCullough and the HBO miniseries took Adams at his word, it's going to be historically inaccurate. And indeed, it's not just sort of the interpretation of Dickinson, but even if you follow the HBO miniseries, they kind of mess with the chronology of events, and it's certainly not something you can kind of take at face value. And so, public history is very important. It's crucial that Americans understand where we came from and our founding principles, and that we have heroes to look up to. Democratic myths are crucial for a democratic society such as ours. But I also think it's important to have a more nuanced view and an understanding of how important dissent is, and not to just vilify people who disagree with us. Otherwise, we kind of find ourselves in a political moment like we're in today, where we can't even have a conversation with someone who disagrees with us politically.
So describe John Dickinson physically.
Well, he was very tall and thin. And he, like many people of the 18th century, he suffered from various physical ailments throughout his life that sometimes laid him low for days or weeks at a time. So he was, frequently, as John Adams remarked, somewhat pale, but he was surprisingly robust and energetic. And this was also something that his opponents recognized, that, he sort of had a fire in him that would come out when he spoke about things he cared about, such as politics. And so he was actually a very charismatic individual, and was able to rouse Americans of all persuasions and move them to action. And so his sometimes apparent or seeming physical frailty was really not. Was really just a superficial impression. And otherwise, he was also seen as very sort of elegant and graceful, and he was kind of a natural athlete, and really enjoyed different kinds of sports. He played he played what they called battledore and shuttlecock, which we now call badminton. He ice skated. He rode horses. He went for long walks. He was really a proponent of moving and exercise. And So yeah, and he also had kind of a very sort of genteel air about him. He had a prominent nose, and I believe he had blue eyes. And yes, but he was definitely a very sort of striking figure.
In the beginning of your book, you have a chronology, very helpful to we readers. But what I did, though, which I found was interesting, was as I went through the chronology, I put his age on one side and King George III's age on the other side. And obviously, the reason is that King George played a big role back in those days. What value was it for him, meaning John Dickinson, to spend those years, and how many years did he spend in London?
Yeah, he was there for about what was it, 3 years. So yeah, he went over at the end of 1753, and his purpose was to study at the Middle Temple, which was one of the Inns of Court in London. And it's where young men went for their legal training. And he first intended to only spend a couple of years to become a solicitor, but as soon as he got over there and started meeting people, he very quickly impressed the people at the Middle Temple, specifically the treasurer, who was the highest position in the Middle Temple, and so this treasurer persuaded him to stay another year so he could become a full-fledged English barrister. And this was just a remarkably influential moment in his life. So, he went over there with just such excitement to study law and to walk the same halls that his heroes walked, and learn as much as he could. And he was very diligent about that. And yet, he was here in one of the largest cities in the world, and he was just sort of amazed by it, because of course he'd grown up in one of the three lower counties of Pennsylvania, which we now call Delaware. A very quiet rural existence, and even after living in Philadelphia, Philadelphia paled in comparison to the size of London. So he really felt like he was in kind of a social wilderness, and felt very humbled by that, and also just deeply appreciative of the sorts of privileges that he had that his parents had given him. So he engaged in a lot of reflection and soul searching, and he was a young man, 21 years old, and just finding his way in the world. And I think probably the most striking thing to come out of this time was he really recognized that he was American, and that he loved America, and he would never really quite fit in English society, even though he was rubbing elbows with aristocrats. He went to King George II's birthday party, and yet he didn't care about that. He loved America, and he missed America, and started really at that time to identify as an American, which anyone who has lived abroad, I think, can sort of recognize that. And I experienced that myself when I lived in Germany as a 16-year-old. So yeah, it was just really an amazing opportunity for him, and one that I think really shaped his thinking about American identity and his role in the world for the rest of his life.
How would this country be different if he hadn't existed?
So it's funny you should ask that question, because historians typically don't like to engage in counterfactual speculations. But that's kind of a fun one, and I've kind of dabbled in thinking about that. And so just to sort of play this out a little bit. So I think the big criticism of Dickinson is that he was allegedly, kind of a naysayer about the revolution, and he didn't have enough patriotism to vote on or sign the Declaration of Independence. And, he was really not a patriotic figure because of that. But after writing Penman of the Founding and really getting a perspective on Dickinson like I had never had before, it became very clear that he was I would say the single most important individual for America before the Declaration of Independence was passed. And what I mean by that is that without Dickinson, so say Dickinson had not existed, and it was just, people like John Adams and Samuel Adams and, the Lees in Virginia and, firebrands in New York, like Alexander McDougall. Let's just say it was just those people. And Dickinson was not on the scene. I think it would have looked something like this. There would have been, alarm about the taxation. There would have been cries for, representation. But Americans would have sort of careened very quickly to violence, as they did in the Stamp Act crisis. Riots and threats to officials and destruction of property. And this would have all sort of snowballed very quickly and led to a brutal put down by the British government. And at that point, there really wouldn't have been many options for Americans, and the resistance would have been over. What Dickinson did is he unified Americans. He taught them how to think of themselves as Americans, and he taught them about Quaker methods of resistance, namely civil disobedience, and he urged, unity and unifying and resisting peacefully, showing respect for the British Constitution, the relationship of America with Britain. So he moderated Americans' behavior, he slowed them down, and then when it became increasingly clear that America was heading towards independence, Dickinson did really more than any other person to prepare America for a separation with Britain. He was there on the ground, forming the military. He raised troops. He was a colonel. He wrote military regulations, and he just did. He wrote America's first Constitution, and a number of other things that really kept America cohering as much as possible, so that the revolution could be successful. And even John Adams, who really had very little good to say about Dickinson after about 1774, admitted that delaying the Declaration of Independence was a good thing because it allowed the Union to cement a little bit more. I think that was overly optimistic, and there were plenty of ways the American cause faltered after the Declaration. But insofar as it did cohere and was successful, I don't think there is really any other person who can hold a candle to Dickinson when it comes to preparing America for independence.
On May 17th, 1736, in your chronology, declaration of war against France began the 7 Years' War. And then you have the French and Indian War. And, I'll have to admit, I'm not a historian, but thanks to you, I delved into that and didn't realize the connection and the importance of your whole story. In some ways, starts around the French and Indian War. Explain that, and explain the 7 Years' War and the connection there.
Well, so yeah, the 7 Years' War was the sort of the well. Actually, let me start over. The French and Indian War was basically a conflict between the colonies and France. Both Britain and France were trying to expand into the same region of the Ohio Territory, and uh, they clashed, and then that clash led to the 7 Years' War, where the same, France and England were clashing in Europe and on the high seas. And so, Dickinson was he was in London when the declaration of war was issued, and he was hearing from home, for example, his mother writing him letters about destruction by the French that was happening nearby, and she was terrified. And so Dickinson really had a front row seat to what was going on in London at the time. And he was actually, frankly, appalled by how much power the king had. And he wanted there to be sort of rather citizen militias instead of mercenary soldiers being used, Germans, and to fight British battles, and he worried about executive authority, and that once an executive gains more power, he's not going to give it up, and it can only be taken back by force, and that was something he did not like. So yeah, he's watching all this, and then when he came back and began practicing law, a lot of his cases that he took had to do with the war, whether it was, defending, Quakers from, having their property confiscated because they wouldn't serve in the military, or specifically also dealing with prize cases in the Court of Admiralty. So when American ships were taken when ships were taken by American privateers, and then there was a court battle, he would go and frequently defend the merchants, and he was concerned that the British government was trying to limit the kinds of trade that American merchants could practice, and the American merchants were still trading with the French, but they weren't trading. Well, for the most part, they weren't trading arms. And Dickinson believed that Americans should be allowed to trade goods with France, not arms, not warlike provisions. But so he was defending these merchants and arguing that they should be allowed to trade freely as long as they weren't trading arms. And so this was, really some of his earliest thinking that he was doing about American liberties in the face of British restrictions. And I think it really did also kind of inform his later defense of Americans against British unjust British taxation.
King George III didn't become king until 1760, which is the year that John Dickinson's father died, and there were 6 years difference. John Dickinson 6 years older than the king. Now, we're talking young back in those days. But speaking of that, what year did you get your PhD from Chicago?
2003.
Okay. When did you start the John Dickinson Writings Project?
2010. It was right after my first book was published, and that was 2009. And I had other plans. Frankly, I was wanting to go off in a different direction with my research. But I realized that there were so many of these documents that Dickinson had written, and I had been approached by an officer at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he asked me if I would be interested in doing publishing Dickinson's papers. And I said, no, absolutely not. It wasn't anything I wanted to take on. I was trained as a historian, not as a documentary editor. And, but I realized that there were so many of these papers and writings that he had done that people just had no idea about. So I thought, well, I think that, well, somebody definitely needs to do this. And, I was really the only Dickinson scholar in the country. So I realized it probably would fall to me. So I founded the John Dickinson Writings Project.
And this book is published by Oxford, which is a rather important publisher. And how many other books have been written about John Dickinson?
Not many. So this is, I guess, the fourth biography. The first one was in the 1890s, and then the next one was 1983, and then the next one was 2013, and of those, probably the most accurate was the one from 18. I think it was 95 by Charles J. Stillay, and that's probably the most accurate. Although it's dated, we don't write history like that anymore. It doesn't have thorough citations, and it's just not something that most Americans would pick up and read today. Then the 1983 biography was by Milton Flower, and it has a lot of information, not all of which is accurate, and it's a difficult read because it's just sort of packed, maybe a little bit too full, and it's a little bit confusing in the narrative. He doesn't really quite explain Dickinson's stance on independence, and then the next one is by a conservative journalist, and that one it's more readable, and it has some definite strong points in that it credits Dickinson with having a principled position on independence, but it also has inaccuracies, and none of these really details his work after, in his career after the Declaration of Independence in any depth, and that's problematic because he was still remained a leading figure in America after the Declaration, and had just one of the most astounding records of service. And you can't really sort of turn around in early America without running into Dickinson doing something really significant. So my biography is based on the work of the John Dickinson Writings Project. And to be clear, when I was writing the biography, we had not yet published the first volume. We are now about to publish volume 4. And but we had collected almost all of the documents. So I had access to the documents to the extent I had digital images of them, but they weren't all transcribed, and they weren't all annotated. And so, I did the best I could, and I think it's certainly the most thorough treatment of Dickinson, especially his late, the years after independence. But I'm sure once we continue and publish the remaining volumes, new information will come out. I mean, I'm learning something new about Dickinson every single day, and so someone should come along when those volumes are done and do an updated version of the biography.
How did you raise $1.5 million?
Well, it's actually, I think, maybe over 2 million now. I lose track. Oh, well, how did I do it? Lots of 80-hour work weeks, and few vacations, and it's been difficult. So for the first decade or so, I was more or less on my own with the project, and just trying to make progress as best I could with some contractual workers helping, working on transcription. But then we started out with an NEH grant in 2010. And we made remarkable progress.
National
Oh,
Endowment
sorry,
for
National
Humanities.
Endowment for the Humanities. There are two federal agencies that fund these documentary editions. One is the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the other one is the NHPRC, National Historical Publications and Records Commission, which is an arm of the National Archives. And so we got our first NEH grant in 2010, and that lasted a couple of years, and we made remarkable progress. But the NEH is inconsistent in the projects that it funds, and so we were denied funding after that for really inexplicable reasons. And then we were endorsed by the NHPRC,
And that stands for?
The National Historical Publications and Records Commission. And so we then eventually got funding from the NHPRC, and things really came together starting in about 2020 when we got funding from the two federal agencies, and also the state of Delaware contributed. The legislature, at the behest of Governor Carney, voted to give the project $300,000, which would free me from the duties of the day-to-day work, allow me to hire an editor, a full-time editor, to manage the day-to-day, free me from my teaching responsibilities at the University of Kentucky, so I could write the biography. And so we were really fully funded for the first time, and we currently are still working under those grants. And we have a full-time staff of 4 individuals, and some part-time and volunteer workers. And so we're making really wonderful progress. We're about to publish volume 4, which takes us up through 1769. And we're starting on volumes 5 and 6, which take us up through 1776. So the most important documents for the semi-quincentennial celebrations. Unfortunately, however, we were recently denied renewed funding by the NHPRC for funding in 2025. And this was also a real blow, considering that we had met all of our performance objectives and or exceeded them, and just are doing such amazing work. So the agency itself seems to be experiencing some confusion with policy. It's also suffering from underfunding. And so, yes, it's still sort of hard to understand how this agency that was founded, it was established specifically to fund founding fathers' documentary editions of their papers, and to deny the most important author of the founding era funding is just kind of incomprehensible. So we are facing a shortfall, and if we don't get some emergency funding before long, we'll have to start laying off staff, which will be really, really tragic.
And why did you decide not to continue with the University of Kentucky as a professor?
Well, that was a very difficult decision. I originally got my PhD because I wanted to teach at the college level. Civic education, I think, is the most important and thing that we can do for young people in this country, and it's very much lacking. But unfortunately, the University of Kentucky, like many institutions in this country, had started pressuring faculty to pass students who could not do college level work, students who could not really effectively read or write. And the pressure to quote unquote just pass students who could not do college level work was so extreme that it really turned into kind of harassment by the administration. And I realized that I just really could not look myself in the mirror anymore if I stayed a part of that corrupt system. And it just broke my heart every day to see students having legitimate mental health crises because they were floundering in a system that really was not helping them succeed. And so I did what I had to do according to my conscience, and I resigned my position.
Did you tell the university how you feel?
I did.
What was their reaction?
Goodbye. I'm sure that they were quite relieved to be rid of me. I was a thorn in their side.
Sounds like a good book. A Thorn in Their Side. We go back to John Dickinson and the Stamp Act. Stamp Act comes up in history all the time. Would you tell us exactly what that means? And if you lived in those days, how did you buy your stamps and why?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so right, the Stamp Act was a way that Parliament devised to raise a revenue on the colonies, to basically pay for the 7 Years' War, and they did this by decreeing that any paper used in the colonies must receive a stamp. And this wasn't this type of stamp that you would lick and stick on a piece of paper. It was an embossed, sort of a stamp that is pressed into the paper. And so this included paper that was used for everything from playing cards and newspapers to legal documents. And so you'd have to pay to get this stamp embossed on your paper, or the whatever was on the paper would be, it would be illegal or invalid. And so Dickinson saw this coming and was very concerned about it. And his concern was mainly for ordinary Americans, working Americans, people of what they were considered to be the lower sort in the natural hierarchy. And he was worried about them, that they would be least able to afford these stamps. And they also were the people who most needed contracts with their employers for their protection. So this was, he was very concerned. And sure enough, this was a burden on the colonies. And so, and people began, they wrote against it. Elite folks were writing pamphlets and treatises against it, as they did against the Sugar Act, but they really didn't have much of a solution. And there were even some people like Benjamin Franklin who thought the Stamp Act was a fine idea and didn't have any problem with it. And so, there was sort of this either complacency on the one hand or just reluctance on the other, because basically Americans and British people, including Americans, really generally only had a few tools that they could use for dissent or resisting the government. On the one hand, the sort of what we might consider to be conservatives, they believed that the king was put in place by God, and whatever he chose to do was lawful, and even if it was not. Even if they didn't like it, they should obey. And on the other hand, there were the radicals, the Whigs, who believed that the king and the government were basically in a contract with the people, and if they violated that contract, the people had the right to overthrow the government. So these were the Whigs who fomented the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and which was in fact a bloodless revolution, but nevertheless violence and threats of violence were what the Whigs used. So in America, generally, people thought in the same terms, and so the elites did not ever endorse any particular any particular method, except for they would lead riots. or they would advocate evading the act. But yeah, there weren't really any good solutions, and so riots erupted, and there was some talk about boycotting and non-importation, but it didn't take off really fully across the colonies, and so riots erupted. And Dickinson, meanwhile, looked around and was very concerned about either acquiescing to the Parliament or violence breaking out. So he actually wrote the first, it's just a little broadside that he wrote directed to ordinary Americans, instructing them first about why the Stamp Act was dangerous, that they should not set a precedent of obeying this act. And number two, that they should not evade the act. And number three, they should actually disobey the unjust law. And it was the civil disobedience that Quakers had always used to resist religious oppression. And he said, basically, go about your business as usual and pretend like the Stamp Act doesn't exist, and eventually it will be repealed. Now, this came too late in the game for really any effect. The Parliament repealed the Stamp Act before Dickinson's advice could be really implemented. But nevertheless, this broadside got a lot of attention around the colonies, and the Sons of Liberty adopted it, and people in faraway colonies celebrated it, and so it was the basis of what Dickinson would advocate in his most famous publication, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, in 1767 and 68.
The letters, the 12 letters, and thanks to you, I could find them all on online, along with the the Fabius opinions. This seems to me, for an amateur like me, the simplest way to hear his voice. And so talk more about the 12 letters. I wrote some stuff down from them. Here's just an excerpt from letter 3. My 2 former letters to you have been generally received with so much favor by such of you whose sentiment I haven't had an opportunity of knowing. And that's obviously praising himself, but there's lots more to this. Where were those letters written? Where was he physically at the time? And where could you read them?
So he was living in Philadelphia at that time and practicing law. He had been serving in the Pennsylvania legislature. He wasn't in the legislature at that time, however. So yeah, he was in Philadelphia, and he wrote these letters and then published them in the newspapers. And he sent them also, not just in Philadelphia, but he sent them also up to James Otis in Boston for publication up there. And so they came out beginning, I believe, on December 3rd and stretching through February, and about every couple of weeks. And he had several goals. The first was to raise awareness about the unjust law, to instruct Americans about the injustice and that they should resist, and also how they should resist, and most importantly, to see themselves as Americans with a distinct American identity apart from their British identity, and to unite. And so as these started to come out, they immediately garnered attention. And one of the earliest examples we see of that is that in Boston, they were so well received that the Massachusetts legislature immediately acted on his advice and issued their famous circular letter that went out to all the colonies advocating a non-importation agreement and unity amongst the colonies. And so then letters of gratitude began pouring in from all colonies. And Dickinson could barely keep up with it all. And really, these letters launched him to international celebrity. And I use that word the word celebrity very purposefully. It was so the first celebrity in the Atlantic world was the minister George Whitefield, the evangelical minister, and he traveled around and he had crowds following him wherever he went. Most people knew who he was. Dickinson, after the Farmer's Letters, became the first American-born celebrity. So tributes were written to him. Images created in, etchings and paintings and statues, and songs were written, and people named things after him, their taverns, their ships, a stud horse, and everyone knew the Pennsylvania farmer as he was called, and they just swept. They just swept the colonies, and they were known as far away as Poland, and yeah, they are very readable. My students loved them because they're very accessible. They're very compelling. You really, as you said, hear his voice, and because he was very purposefully speaking to ordinary Americans, and he called them out and said, you might, just because you're poor, don't think that your voice doesn't matter, because you never know what might happen if you speak up. And this was a very unusual stance for an elite person to take. Usually, elites did not think it was wise to speak to ordinary Americans or ordinary people simply because they thought they were lacking in virtue and couldn't really be trusted, and they really did not have a voice in any sense. But Dickinson spoke to them particularly, and they responded to him, and he became their hero.
I have to admit that letter 10 got my attention. Primarily, he talks about salaries of ministers, and he's focusing on Ireland, and he suggests that you get around and know something about other countries. Then I also, this is like it would be today, he wanted to point out that the immense estates of Lord Fairfax and Lord Baltimore, both names very well known in this country, but they weren't, I doubt if they were in this country at that time, were they?
Fairfax, sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, in fact, Frederick Calvert, the Lord Baltimore, who was the proprietor of Maryland, he was one of Dickinson's clients. So yeah, their names were there, and their names were known. Certainly,
he was one of his clients, and he's still knocking the size of his estate in this letter.
Oh, absolutely. Dickinson was, he was also friends with Thomas Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, but he believed that the ultra rich ought not to get any special treatment, and especially they ought to be taxed equitably with ordinary Americans. And so he really felt as though he needed to speak on behalf of ordinary folks. I mean, a lot of his clients were poor farmers who were barely literate and certainly could not, could barely, they couldn't understand the legal documents that they needed to survive. And so he worked with them, and not only in his law practice, but he passed legislation to help them with their legal troubles. And so no, he was a huge proponent for equal treatment under the law, and he thought that wealthy people ought to be paying their more taxes, that there should be more of a tax burden on the rich because they could afford it better.
Here's just one more of the letters, and we can go to other things. Letter 7. Whatever regard we entertain for the persons of those who govern us, we should always remember that their conduct as rulers may be influenced by I think I wrote down by human frailties.
Mm-hmm.
What's he saying there?
Well, that political leaders are as fallible as the rest of us. And he was, I would say that this is a tactful way of warning Americans about political corruption. Political corruption was one of Dickinson's main concerns. He tried to get legislation passed in Pennsylvania that would disallow legislators from accepting posts of honor or profit that would interfere with their legislative work. And I think he may have had Benjamin Franklin particularly in mind with that, because he knew Franklin was always on the lookout for opportunities for himself. And he was really a champion of virtue, disinterested engagement by citizens, but especially their political leaders. And he himself was a model of this virtuous behavior, and was very diligent about not accepting anything that would tarnish his disinterest or his reputation. If he thought that anybody was being dishonest with him in his law practice, he would refuse to represent them. He always donated his salaries from his public service to charitable causes. He really sort of kept on the straight and narrow where that was concerned, and he expected the same out of other political leaders.
If you actually knew him, is there anything about him you think you would not like?
Well, so he could be pedantic. When he felt very strongly about things. He was a very highly educated person, and he took his role as teacher very seriously, and in the best sense of the idea, namely that a gentleman who has privileges, the privilege of education, the luxury of time, should use those privileges for the good of their fellow creatures. And so, but sometimes he could cross the line from sort of offering I guess you would consider it helpful advice, to being a little bit maybe a little bit preachy, and that could rub some people the wrong way. So I could definitely see being maybe in conversation with him or hearing him and feeling bristling a little bit at somebody sort of presuming to lecture you on on what's the right thing to do. But then again, that was a criticism that many people leveled against Quakers in general, that they were a little bit too they were busybodies and a little too concerned for other people's souls, and would kind of preach to them if they thought their souls were in danger. So yeah, I mean, it was a fault he came by honestly, however.
So how are you going to find some more money for your project?
Well, that's a good question. That's my main priority at the moment. We have some private foundations who have helped us in the past and who are appreciative of our work, so we will return to them. We are looking to apply to new foundations. We have collaborators we're working with. We hope to make applications with. We need to reach out to ordinary folks who find value in these founding era papers and documents, to ask for their help. we will reapply to the federal agencies. But yeah, we're in a precarious position, and if we don't get help, it's very likely that the project will have to fold. And we're only, we've just published volume 4 of 13 anticipated volumes. We're just getting to the seminal documents of the American Revolution in the First and Second Continental Congresses, where Dickinson wrote most of the important documents. And so, yeah, I suppose, if anybody is interested in donating, there is there's an address on the John Dickinson Writings Project website that they can look at and write a check if they're so inclined.
Is this project separate from the University of Kentucky?
Yes, it always has been. It's based with me. We have had various institutional homes, starting with the University of Kentucky. We are currently at the University of Delaware, but they, because of difficulties and budgetary difficulties, they have had to say that they can't host us anymore. So we're in the process of trying to find a new home. And the problem is that when most of these projects of the major founders, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Franklin, and these projects are all based at major research institutions and have always had their support. But that's a bygone era, and institutions don't support these projects anymore. So it's really incumbent upon me as an individual to try to secure funding for this project, which it costs around $300,000 a year to produce these volumes. They are extraordinarily labor intensive. This is some of the most difficult historical work that can be done. And Dickinson's papers are more difficult than most of the founders because of his level of education, because of his activities, and his law practice and his erudition, his literary references, his biblical references. And also his very sometimes inscrutable handwriting and messy drafts. And so the skills and the education of the editors who undertake this work really needs to be of the highest order. And it takes over 6 months to train an editor to work with these materials. So it's my team is amazing. They astound me every single day, but they need to be paid. Well, they're still not paid what they're worth, I don't believe. But I have to secure funding to pay them. Otherwise, they'll be forced to find employment elsewhere.
The name of the book is Penman of the Founding. It's a biography of John Dickinson, and our guest has been Jane Calvert. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program, and don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.